Hey there, Onco PTs, and welcome to this episode of the Onco PT podcast. I'm so excited you're here. Today is going to be another great episode because I am coming off of this high that I had this weekend. So if you didn't know, if you didn't see my social media stories, I went to the Cowtown Oncology Nursing Symposium this past weekend here in Fort Worth, Texas. And I know you might be thinking, Elise, okay, I get the oncology side, but why the nursing side? And there's really actually a lot of reasons why we should be branching out and going to these different conferences. But I'm getting ahead of myself because I think I really need to start this episode with I had major FOMO after APTA CSM this year. So quick recap, I did not go to CSM this year. A couple different reasons. Our pre-con was canceled. I was absolutely just crushed when that happened. And my husband and I decided that, you know what? This year we're going to go and see our friends get married in Mexico. So we said, you know what? CSM's not going to happen. We're going to take that money. We're going to put it towards Mexico. And we're just going to stay home here in February. And it was great. It was honestly very needed for multiple reasons. My sister also came to visit, which was a tremendously helpful, almost grieving experience because of our pre-con getting canceled. But anyways, enough dwelling on that. It was so cool to see all the different videos and photos of people connecting at CSM. And I felt like I was really missing out, hence where that FOMO really comes in. And so I was really excited when I knew that, okay, I couldn't go to CSM this year. I did not go to CSM this year, but I have Cowtown coming up. And Cowtown Oncology Nursing Symposium, again, this is the conference I went to this past weekend. It is a 2-day community-based oncology nursing conference that is put on by these amazing group of nurses who are affiliated with, again, this Fort Worth and Dallas chapters of ONS. I really got plugged into this a few years ago, first with my mom and my sister, who are both oncology nurses. They have gone to these conferences previously and they've always really enjoyed them. But I never thought it was really pertinent for me because I was like, that's nursing and I'm in rehab, I'm in physical therapy. But imagine my surprise when I went for the first time a few years ago and really discovered, oh my gosh, this is really good information that I otherwise never would have gotten probably for another 5 to 10 years. And I think that is what is so cool about this conference is, even though it is directed at nurses, the majority of the attendees are nurses. Literally on day 2, one of the speakers asked who all was not a nurse in attendance at this conference, and it was me and one other person, and we're both in exercise, which is so funny. So anyways, very much, again, content is directed at nursing, but there were so many takeaways from this conference and just going to a non-physical therapy conference in general that I think really helped me get very clear on some of the issues and maybe some solutions that are facing oncology as a whole and what we can do to potentially fix those. So again, you may be thinking, Elise, okay, I already spend enough money. I already spend enough time and energy going to these various physical therapy conferences. Why the heck would I choose to go to a nursing conference? And I think there's actually a few reasons you should definitely check it out. Now, this may not be a nursing conference you go to, but I think there's a lot of reasons why we should be attending a conference outside of your discipline, outside of your specialty. And here's the first one, which is you're straight up going to learn new information. Now, this may seem obvious. Yes, I go to conferences to learn new information. But I think I really want to capitalize on the new information part of things because conferences outside of our specialty, outside of our discipline, can really introduce us sooner, earlier to emerging and new technologies and treatment modalities and frankly, best practices when it comes to enhancing our own clinical practice. Now, one of the things that I think was so cool. So on day 2 of the presentation, there was an oncologist who was presenting on gynecological cancer, specifically endometrial and cervical cancer. My bad, y'all. And what was so interesting, the speaker talked about gynecological cancers, endometrial cancer is on the rise compared to ovarian cancer, and for some really interesting reasons. And then this person also talked about how immunotherapy has historically not been used as much in this patient population. We've seen it in other patient populations, but really not in this world. And we are sitting, like literally here in Fort Worth, Texas, because this person is in Fort Worth doing research in Fort Worth. We are sitting on a gold mine of information that is about to be published in the New England Journal of Medicine, like within the next month, about how immunotherapy is being used effectively, successfully in endometrial cancer. Y'all, I would not have known this information for probably like maybe a year at the earliest. I'm going to say probably like a couple years from now, because of how long it really takes, unfortunately, for information to trickle down from the medical side of things. Like, okay, this is the cancer treatment we're going to use in this particular patient population. And then actually, like, okay, now that this is being used in this patient population, that we as rehab providers, as rehab professionals, are seeing the patients who are being treated with this immunotherapy. And now we're starting to discern or observe or figure out what are some of these side effects that our patients are experiencing. What does this ultimately mean for us? So all this to say, the information that was covered at this conference, particularly regarding immunotherapy, which we're going to be talking a lot about today, I don't think I would have heard that information. I don't think I would have learned that information. I don't think I would have been incorporating it into my clinical practice for another 2 to 3, maybe even 5 years. If I had waited for this information to reach me via the Great Wide World Web, and then ultimately like patients being treated with this and then being seen by me. So that was such a cool, I kind of felt like I was on the front row of like a movie premiere, not like a movie premiere in the sense of like glamour, but this information, it was almost like I was on the ground floor of research that is actually being done when it comes to the treatment of these cancers that have very historically been very challenging to treat. And that was so freaking cool. Again, I don't think I would have gotten that information otherwise in such a timely fashion unless I had gone to this conference, because this is where those conversations start, because the nurses are seeing these patients first, right? And I would argue that I think if we are going to these oncologist conferences, I'm thinking like ASCO and all these other conferences where the medical, like when we think of the oncology medical team, when those professionals, when those providers are at these conferences learning these things, we need to be there too. Because I can guarantee you, there are considerations that they're not thinking about that we absolutely have the expertise and the knowledge in. Anyways, can you tell I'm really excited about this? Like, this was such a dynamic conference. I've always really enjoyed this conference. I've been going for the past few years. But this year, I felt like I finally knew enough information, especially about immunotherapy, where I was like, oh, that makes so much more sense. So anyways, like super cool stuff. Going to a conference outside of oncology physical therapy, outside of cancer rehab, you're going to learn new things. Again, I learned so much about proton therapy that I've never known before. Proton therapy is not very common. There are not that many centers in the United States still. However, there is one in my backyard, basically. There is one here in the Fort Worth, Dallas Metroplex. And so I definitely need to hop on this information now that I've been exposed to it, again, via the Oncology Nursing Symposium. Like, I need to dive into this because there's so much stuff that I need to know, and I definitely would not have known that without this conference. So number one, you'll learn new information. Number two, you're going to learn different information about things you already know. And what I mean by this is patients with cancer don't just have cancer, right? When a person is diagnosed with cancer, they're not just siloed into this oncology, okay, like now you're a cancer patient. Our patients are incredibly medically dynamic and complex and complicated. They don't just have cancer. They have a whole slew of other conditions that they're dealing with. Maybe those are pertaining or related to their cancer diagnosis. Maybe it's something different entirely altogether. Maybe they just happen to have this other diagnosis and, oh yeah, then they get cancer on top of it. And when we attend conferences that are outside of our specialty or outside of our discipline, this exposes us to new information about these conditions that can therefore broaden our knowledge and our understanding and frankly our skill set when it comes to better managing our patients. So one of the things that we talked about at this conference, there was a speaker who discussed MDS, which of course now I'm going to forget the name of it that I'm on camera, myelodysplasia syndrome. Let me check on that real quick. Okay, myelodysplastic syndromes. For some reason, my brain just like turned off when it came to that. So MDS, myelodysplastic syndromes, these are actually cancers. These are classified under the cancer spectrum. And for whatever reason, I knew that a person who developed MDS was at an increased risk of developing like leukemia down the road. But for whatever reason, I never really grasped that these are actually a cancer. These are a group of cancers. And so kind of flipping the script on this like precancerous condition in my brain to like, no, these are actually a cancer and they need to be treated as a cancer really helped me kind of hone in on why I sometimes saw some of the patients I previously did referred from a hematologist when I was like, I don't actually know why you're here. Like I literally had a patient one time who was coming into my clinic who was referred and like didn't really know what was going on as far as like why he was in a cancer clinic because he had never been told like, oh, you have colorectal cancer or you have lung cancer. He was getting these blood testing to kind of figure out what was going on anyways. And so helping me understand like, why am I seeing some of these patients? It's because of insert XYZ. Again, more information about these conditions I've had exposure to, I've seen previously, but really don't have that much experience or understanding the ramifications of these conditions. Now, at this conference, one of the speakers really talked about just how landmark, again, immunotherapy is going to be in the treatment of endometrial cancer. Listen, I know about endometrial cancer. I actually do know quite a bit about immunotherapy, but seeing these worlds cross over like that is so exciting. And I never would have heard of that and never would have learned about that or seen it in quite this light like I did after going to this conference. So again, it's not just the new information out there, it's the information about things you think you've already known about, but maybe an extra layer or in a new light, spun in a different direction that are ultimately going to help you better treat your patients at the end of the day. Now, the third reason you should attend conferences outside of your discipline are so that we can understand perspectives and viewpoints of other healthcare professionals. When we attend conferences kind of outside of our PT or our rehab bubble, we're then able to foster relationships and connections with other healthcare providers. Again, so at this conference, it's kind of cool because it's contained in one room, like everybody goes to the same presentations at the same time. So it's more of a like round tables everywhere, you're at chairs, and then you all listen to the speaker. And what I really appreciate about that setup is because we're at tables, like you had more time to really get to know people than I think sometimes we do at CSM, right? There's a little bit of break time where you could get to know people, but at this conference, I mean, like you were at the table you were at because you picked that seat, and then, you know, whoever happened to sit next to you, like you got to know them. And so these conversations about, you know, like, hey, tell me about your practice. Where do you work? How long have you been working there? What kind of patients are you seeing? And then after the different presentations, we would almost kind of do a little debrief as far as what does that mean for your clinical practice? And it was so interesting to really learn about the implications for nursing, but then again, extrapolating, what does this mean for rehab? What does this mean for us? Again, so that we can better help our patients now armed with this knowledge, with this information. So again, opportunities to collaborate potentially, like discussing patient cases, how we would handle them with each other. And it was really interesting to almost be put on the spot in a way, and this in the best way possible. There was a speaker who I've actually previously worked alongside, who is a pelvic floor physical therapist. She was there on day one when we were focusing entirely on prostate cancer. And so she really talked about, you know, what are the pelvic floor needs of patients with prostate cancer? How do treatments potentially affect the person? how does pelvic floor physical therapy help these patients diagnosed and treated for prostate cancer? And so it was so interesting to get to hear and discuss the nursing perspective of, okay, tell me more about this. Even though I was very clear on this, I even said so in front of the whole room, I'm not a pelvic floor physical therapist, but I have a really good understanding of what are some of the impairments and then how can PT help with each of those things. And so again, getting to offer that insight, but then also understand what are some of the, experiences and perspectives from the nursing side. What are some potential even barriers to getting patients connected, even in setups where there is a rehab, like there is a rehab department who participates in cancer rehab. So again, really getting to understand these different perspectives and viewpoints of healthcare professionals only helps to serve and improve our own clinical practice by making us aware of these other issues that these other professionals are dealing with in the day in and day out in oncology. There was another presentation on oncofertility. She was great. I'm actually trying to get her on the podcast, so stay tuned for that. The speaker referenced an ASCO practice guideline update back in 2013, which is actually a little while ago, but I think is just as pertinent today because, again, I knew it's an issue. I never knew that I had a role to play in all of this because in this ASCO practice guideline update, they specifically talked about it is not just the oncologist's responsibility and role to talk about potential implications on fertility when it comes to cancer and cancer treatment. This is actually an all hands on deck kind of situation because, unfortunately, of how often it is historically not been talked about, how challenging it is to sometimes get patients in to these services in a timely fashion. All hands on deck. And it literally lists out in this article, I've included it in the show notes for you to find, but it literally states all oncologic healthcare providers should be prepared to discuss infertility as a potential risk of treatment. And it lists out a bunch of professionals, associated, included in the oncology care continuum, but it also includes non-physician providers. And I forget the exact language in there, but guess who is included in this list? Us, you and me. That's right. I never would have considered myself a part of that conversation other than I like to talk to my patients and we like to talk about a bunch of different things. We are actually implored to have these conversations. And again, it was really interesting at this conference to consider what are some of the challenges that the oncology nurses are facing when it comes to educating patients. How can I help fill in some of those gaps when maybe they are literally so overrun with patients like that is getting lost? I can have those conversations. I can spend 5 minutes of my session with my patient to discuss this and then connect them with the appropriate referral. Am I treating the infertility? Absolutely not. Am I screening for infertility issues? Absolutely not. Can I plant that seed in my patients' minds to hopefully get them to the point where they're aware and connected with the appropriate resource for that? Absolutely. And you should be doing the same thing too. Other reason and last reason that you need to attend a non-physical therapy, non-cancer rehab conference is it is prime time for networking and advocating, my friend. Again, when we're networking, when we're connecting, when we're frankly chatting with other people at the conference over a cup of tea or coffee, I drank copious tea this weekend, obviously. We can really help to gain new insights and perspectives on patient care, which ultimately only serve to improve our clinical outcomes, not just as the rehab professional, but across the board, right? With all the other specialties and services within cancer care. This only helps our patients at the end of the day. And so when we're attending conferences, it's helping us, of course, stay on top of our knowledge, but also expanding just the opportunities for making people aware of what we do. I went to this conference to learn first and foremost, but after, especially the pelvic floor presentation, when I had so many nurses around me who very verbally stated, wow, I had no idea that that was so important, that was so beneficial. It was probably the accidental opportunity I needed to then initiate conversations and say, yeah, that is so common. Unfortunately, this is a really big issue. Let's talk more about the ways that cancer rehab can help our patients, and follow up, right? You can't just leave it at that. Also, how can you get people connected with the necessary cancer rehab services, right? You don't have to do all the heavy lifting, my dear oncology nurse, because I know you're overworked, you're underpaid, and frankly, you have patients exploding out of your ears at this point, unfortunately. How can you get a patient the information they need and then move on so that you can get back to doing all the other things that you have to do on your day-to-day basis? A couple resources if you are looking for this information. I got up and spoke at the microphone because a question came up. So here in Fort Worth, Dallas, which you can tell that I'm in Fort Worth because I used to say Fort Worth first. In Fort Worth, Dallas Metroplex, on the Dallas side, which is east of us, there is a tremendously increased amount of both pelvic floor therapists, but also lymphedema therapists, and frankly, cancer rehab specialists, period, compared to here in Fort Worth. Fort Worth is actually one of the largest and growing cities in the United States, and we are sometimes considered, I would say, like a little bit of a healthcare desert, especially for specific things like cancer and lymphedema. Y'all, it is the Wild West out here, and not in a good way. So anyways, one of the questions was, hey, I'm in insert city west of Fort Worth, and I have patients who definitely could benefit from this. How can I help them get connected with sources, or, like a physical therapist, etc.? And so I got up and I talked about Find a PT, which is APTA's, search tool, search engine that you can use to find a physical therapist and narrow down by specialty in your own area. And then I also talked about APTA's pelvic health. They have a similar search tool, again, that is very specific to pelvic floor. APTA doesn't pay me for this, but they totally should, because I'm definitely helping them get patients, at least helping our profession get patients. But anyways, just giving out that information, it's not a lot, right? There's so much more education I could be doing. There's so much more of that information I could be giving out. But even just starting with that could be a really powerful connector for patients to actually get the services they need in their community. Again, we have a tremendous lack here in Fort Worth. Unfortunately, I am working on it. Believe me, I'm working on it. But that may be something that can help just a few more patients get the services they need, so that they don't have to deal with these adverse side effects of cancer treatment and cancer for the long term, like unfortunately many patients are. And I would be willing to bet it is the same in your area too. So again, lots of advocating for patients, lots of educating other nurses about the opportunities, the benefits for patients when it comes to cancer rehab. But also, I definitely did some networking, y'all. You better believe that I was out there with my stack of business cards, handing them out like candy, because I know that my biggest referral source in my private practice is word of mouth. And if I can put a friendly face, and I was pretty cute, I had my hair and my makeup did for this conference, if I can connect a friendly face with a knowing source of information, that means that they're more likely going to get patients connected to cancer rehab. Again, physical therapy and cancer rehab is kind of this ideal, I think, in many people's minds in oncology. And that's a good thing. But because it's an ideal, it's a concept. It's not a person, and it's oftentimes not a clinic that people can say, you know what, I have experience with that. I know they do good stuff. I know they know their stuff. I'm going to send you there. That's what I think is really missing in a lot of cases. And so again, by putting my face out there as, hi, my name is Dr. Lisa K. Canthu. I'm a board certified oncologic clinical specialist. I'm a physical therapist. I am a LANA certified lymphedema therapist, although they don't always know what that part means. They know lymphedema. And honestly, y'all, when I say that their ears and their eyes perked up when I say I am a lymphedema therapist, They may not know all the things that cancer rehab can do, but they know lymphedema. Man, nobody is treating lymphedema out here. How can I get patients to you because they need it so badly? I mean, y'all. So again, that is probably one of the coolest things that I really took away from this conference is like, even though I've been in cancer rehab for a while, even though I've been in Fort Worth for a while, the connections aren't there still. We have a lot of opportunity to really work on this. And I think I am on the right track, which is really cool. So to wrap up this episode, I want to share with you just a few key takeaways from Cowtown Oncology Nursing Symposium that I really, really enjoyed, and I know you're going to love too. So first and foremost, I have to mention proton therapy. Man, is that stuff cool. And the speaker who talked on proton therapy was probably one of the most, like, the smartest and able to communicate that information in such a clear way. It was phenomenal. I need this person to explain a lot more of cancer treatment to me because it was so good. I'm trying to get this person on the podcast. Stay tuned. I'm working on it, okay? But proton therapy is really exciting. And what it is a special type of radiation therapy, except normal radiation therapy, like when I think of external beam radiation therapy that the majority of my patients go through, that is the use of photons. Now we're getting a little subatomic here. Work with me. Proton therapy uses protons instead of photons, like in traditional radiation therapy. Now, what you need to know, because I am not going to get into the molecular basics of all this, proton therapy is going to shoot protons at cancer cells to kill them. And the example that the presenter used was genius. So I want you to think of Randy Johnson, the pitcher. I think he was like a Diamondbacks or D-backs pitcher in the early 2000s. So this particular pitch I'm talking about happened in 2001. I have linked the video in the show notes if you would like to educate yourself on this, because I really didn't know about this. What happened? Randy Johnson threw a pitch in a spring training game, whatever, in 2001, and he threw the pitch and it hit a bird who unfortunately had the supreme misfortune to fly between the pitcher's mound and home plate at that exact moment. And there is a photograph and actually a video of the bird getting hit by the baseball, and the bird like explodes. I mean, just disintegrates. Okay, so take that visual. That's what proton therapy does to cancer cells. Now, maybe not in such a large white feathery explosion, but that's basically the premise of this. And for some reason, when that presenter used that analogy, it just clicked in my brain. And the speed at which they are basically pew pew these protons at the cancer cells, I think he said in the accelerator or whatever device they use to like speed up these protons, they're going at 2/3 the speed of light. My tiny brain cannot even compute that. But anyways, it was so cool, and it really seems like it is. I know it's not widely available right now. I'm hoping that changes within the next 10 to 20 years, especially in light of like payment, etc. But the physician who spoke about this was so good at explaining the different side effects, the process of how proton therapy works, how it's drastically improving side effects. So specifically, he talked about the use of proton therapy in prostate cancer, which was really cool. But he also mentioned a little bit, specifically, there's some really cool research going on with esophageal cancer. Many patients, maybe not many, I would say a good chunk of patients will go through radiation therapy prior to surgery for esophageal cancer. And in the studies where they were juxtaposing proton therapy versus radiation therapy, the proton therapy treated group had a dramatic decrease in the length of hospital stay after their surgery, which is really, really cool. It has to do a lot with potential side effects, infections, whatever. So this is really, really cool stuff. I don't think it's going to replace radiation therapy, unfortunately, anytime soon. Because radiation therapy works, right? I'm not saying that radiation therapy is evil. It works. It's accessible. It's frankly a little more like accepted widely within the oncology field. Not that proton therapy isn't, but as far as like availability of services, radiation therapy is definitely reigning supreme right now. If you'd like more information on radiation therapy and how it affects your patients, my new MedBridge course called Radiation Therapy, What Every Rehab Professional Needs to Know is available now on MedBridge. I've included the link in the show notes. Otherwise, you can go to theoncopt.com/MedBridge and use the code TheOncoPT to save up to $150 on your MedBridge subscription. So definitely check that out. And I think I'm going to need to do an update or at least an addendum because of how excited I am now about proton therapy. Like, y'all, this wave of the future. I feel like that's my new phrase all the time. It's so cool, and I'm really excited to learn more about this proton therapy, especially because there is a center here in Fort Worth, Dallas area that could really help a lot of my patients. So we'll see about that. Number 2 takeaway. Tumors can have mutations. We know that cancer arises as a result of a series of mutations of normal body cells becoming cells that no longer look or function like they're supposed to. In fact, they harm the body. And I kind of knew this information, but from a very adjacent, removed perspective. I never realized or really thought about the fact that tumors themselves can have mutations. And again, maybe you're listening to this and you're thinking, Elise, I already knew this, catch up. Or you might be thinking, what? Which is where I was earlier this weekend. But essentially, the replication process of cancer cells can snowball to the point that cancer cells are themselves mutating. And again, this has a couple different implications on oncology care. So if a cancer or some of the cancer cells mutate to the point that they are the ones, again, this is like some natural selection, some Darwin stuff here, they may no longer be responding to the cancer treatment that was working so well previously. And so because they have these mutations, they and I say the scientists and researchers have figured out that this mutation of this cancer cell or these cancer cells are not going to respond to this treatment, but they may respond to this treatment. Or unfortunately, in many cases, I feel like this was kind of a theme of this weekend, unfortunately, there are definitely some mutations, some predictors, some indicators, some biomarkers, etc., that we can test for in certain diagnoses because we've gotten so good at it, we've gotten so specific now, that can tell us if a person is going to respond to treatment X or not, their cancer is going to respond to that treatment or not. So that was really interesting, and it kind of put immunotherapy in a little different light for me as far as the specificity of when they are selecting various immunotherapy for patients. So next point is immunotherapy is evolving. And I think that is what is so stinking cool over the last few years. I've learned a bit about immunotherapy and continuing to learn about immunotherapy. I have a lot more to learn about immunotherapy in the best way possible. When I first started practicing as an oncology physical therapist almost 5 years ago, which is crazy, we talked about that in a previous episode, immunotherapy, at least in the practice that I was inside of, okay, it may be different at your institution, immunotherapy was kind of this last-ditch effort for patients with incurable cancers. I remember one of my first patients who was on immunotherapy, that I was aware of at least, had metastatic renal carcinoma. I don't remember the subtype. And for him, unfortunately, he had exhausted all the other treatment options available. And so at the time, this particular immunotherapy was kind of new. And it was like, you know what? We have run out of options. Let's try this. And just a few years later, in the year of our Lord and Savior Lady Gaga, 2023, my understanding of immunotherapy has changed so much for the better. So at this conference this weekend, because there was a breakfast that was actually put on by one of the pharmaceutical companies talking about their immunotherapy. There was a dinner later in the evening that was talking about testing for these different markers and whatnot to better select and prescribe targeted therapy, immunotherapy for hard to treat cancer diagnoses. And then throughout the content of this conference, it was repeated again and again, not in a redundant way, but in a way that was like, I finally realized the tremendous importance of testing for these different biomarkers and really what that means for selecting prescribing immunotherapy. One of the presenters made the analogy of when we treat breast cancer, and I say we in the royal we, like the collective oncology community, when we treat breast cancer, we would never start treating a person's breast cancer until we knew the status, their ER, PR, HER2 status, right? Like it's absolutely critical information for us to have if we're going to treat this cancer most effectively based on the information and the treatments that are available today. We need to be taking that same approach and applying it to basically all the other cancer diagnoses. And again, you and I, as the Cancer Rehab Pro, are not doing this testing, but I think it puts things in a new light for me as far as understanding why some of my patients are on immunotherapy and why some aren't. And again, it really comes down to we have to understand the cancer diagnosis in and out, not just, oh, breast cancer. I forget, I think it might have been Dr. Liz O'Riordan. She says, breast cancer is not breast cancer, is not breast cancer, is not breast cancer. And it's the same for all the cancers, right? Insert diagnosis, cancer is not cancer, is not cancer, is not cancer. Every cancer is different. And the reason that this is it really comes down to that person's specific biology, as well as the cancer specific biology, the biomarkers and these other characteristics of the cancer that unfortunately have made cancer so hard to treat for so long, but we are finally tapping into some of this information. And part of that fix is it's making immunotherapy and targeted therapy much better because we now know what is going to be most beneficial for these patients. And again, the lifespan, the life expectancy changes and improvements that they presented on these various immunotherapies is so exciting. Like, it was kind of hard not to get a little emotional, I know, at a breakfast, but just the concept of like, oh my God, this is changing the lives of patients. This is actually making people survive cancer for not just the 8 months that they would have historically been given at diagnosis, potentially like years after they were diagnosed with an incurable cancer, they're still alive, which is so exciting. It makes me so happy. So I think, if nothing else, I really walked away with this like newfound appreciation of just how great immunotherapy is, even more than I already had. And that was so cool. The last thing that I want you to take away from my experience at Cowtown Oncology Nursing Symposium is cancer rehab still has a lot of work to do. And I don't tell you this to make you feel discouraged or disheartened. I tell you this to motivate you and inspire you and hopefully light a little flame under your butt to get going. It's very tempting to have gone to this conference and to feel like, you know what, we're saying the same thing we've been saying for years, same message, different day, it's just not working. But it was Cowtown Oncology Nursing Symposium was really eye-opening for me regarding just how much work we still have to do, how far we still have to go. So one of the people that I sat with a couple times at this conference was actually a retired but career oncology nurse who actually practiced at MD Anderson. If you don't know, MD Anderson is like one of the cancer centers here, I mean, in Texas, but also kind of like the United States. Like, it is like they set the standard in a lot of cases. And even this nurse who knows her stuff, y'all, like this is not some dummy, okay? Even she had no idea of how beneficial rehab and physical therapy are for her patients. And this is even after she literally made the comment. She said, I had no idea this was so so helpful. And her child required extensive rehab previously in their life for an entirely non-oncology related diagnosis. So she had a very acute understanding of how beneficial rehab is, but never connected it to her work and how rehab can help oncology patients. And again, even at this major cancer center, where I know they have cancer rehab, right? I know they have cancer rehab therapists because I've talked to a few of them before. We are still not doing a good job of educating, communicating, and advocating for cancer rehab on the widespread scale that we need to. And again, I think it's tempting to say, well, you know what? Dang it. It's hopeless. No, it's not. Because this conference gave me a lot of insight into the cracks in the system where we are falling short of really getting that message through. And I walked away from that conference feeling very invigorated and motivated by that message, because it gives me better insight into why is this still a problem and what do I think I can ultimately do about it. And I hope you will take that information and implement it into your own practice, because y'all, we got some work to do, right? And I'm really, really excited about that. And I hope you are too. Until next time, this is Elise with the Onco PT. And remember, you are exactly the physical therapist your patients with cancer need. So let's get to work.